One summer afternoon in 1876, the widowed Elias Mercer bent down to pick up a toy under his porch, and a rattlesnake was waiting there. The venom spread through his bloodstream, his four young children cried around him, and no one was within reach to help. But just as death loomed, a stranger appeared on the dusty red road, a loaf of bread in her hand, her eyes devoid of fear. She didn't know the family. She had no reason to stop. But she did. And that decision changed everything. Please like, comment with the name of the city you're viewing so I know how far this story has come. And follow to the end. Because this is just the beginning. The rattlesnake didn't rattle. That was the thing Elias Mercer would never quite stop thinking about, even months later when the danger had passed and the scar on his forearm had faded to a pale, crooked seam. Every man on the Montana frontier knew that sound, that dry, papery shaking, like seeds in a gourd, and every man had been taught to freeze when he heard it. But there was no warning, just the sensation of something fast and hard striking the inside of his left wrist, and then a burning so immediate and specific that for one confused second he thought he'd caught the edge of a rusted nail. He yanked his arm back and knocked his head on the underside of the porch, and by the time he'd scrambled out into the late afternoon light and gotten a good look at what had just happened, the snake was already gone, pulled back into whatever dark gap it had been occupying beneath the floorboards. Only the two small puncture wounds, red and already beginning to swell, told him what he already knew. "Papa?" His oldest, Joseph, was standing in the yard with a feed bucket hanging from one hand. He was 11, thin for his age, with his mother's dark eyes and the serious expression of a boy who had been carrying more than his share of worry for 2 years running. He'd seen the way his father came out from under the porch, scrambling, cursing under his breath, clutching his arm, and the color had already started draining from his face. "Come here," Elias said. He kept his voice level, or tried to. "Put that bucket down and come here." Joseph came. He looked at his father's arm without making a sound, and that silence, from a boy that age, told Elias more than any amount of crying would have. "How bad?" Joseph asked. "Don't know yet." Elias pressed his thumb above the puncture marks, hard, the way he'd been shown once by an old army doctor who'd come through Harlan County before Elias was old enough to shave. Whether that did any real good, he couldn't say. It was something to do with his hands. "Go get your sisters, bring them inside. Don't tell Annie what happened, she'll start screaming, and right now I don't need that. She's going to find out anyway. I know, just give me a minute to think first." Joseph set the bucket down and went toward the barn, moving with that careful, deliberate pace he used when he was trying not to run. Elias sat down on the porch steps and looked out across his land. 40 acres, most of it dry and cracked from a summer that had not been generous with rain. The main pasture ran out to the east toward a tree line of cottonwood and scrub pine, and beyond that the mountains stood blue and hazy in the late light. It was beautiful country. Ruth had loved it here, despite everything, despite the winters, despite the isolation, despite the way the wind came down off the peaks in October and made the walls shake. She'd said once that she'd rather have 30 hard years in a place like this than 60 comfortable ones somewhere smaller. She'd gotten 6. Elias pressed his thumb harder against his arm and tried to think clearly. The nearest town was Caldwell Creek, which was 11 miles down a road that turned to mud after any serious rain and was still soft in places from the storm that had blown through 4 days ago. Doc Hargrove kept an office above the hardware store, but Doc Hargrove was also known to be unreliable on Saturdays, which this was. 11 miles. No horse fast enough to make that round trip in time to matter. No neighbors within 4 miles in any direction. He looked at his arm. The swelling had spread to his wrist now, and the skin around the punctures had taken on a dark, bruised color that he didn't like at all. His fingers were beginning to tingle. The children came out of the barn in a cluster. Joseph first, then Nora, who was 9 and had her father's red hair and her mother's stubborn chin. Behind her came Lily, 6 years old and still small enough that she had to take 2 steps to everyone else's 1. And last was Annie, who was 4, and who was already looking at her father's arm with the focused, unblinking attention of a child who knows something is wrong but hasn't yet been told what. "Papa got bit," Nora said, because Nora always found out things before she was supposed to and never saw any reason to pretend otherwise. "Nora," Joseph said. She was going to see it in 2 seconds anyway. Annie's lower lip trembled. "Bit by what?" A snake, Elias said. A rattler. It got me under the porch. He said it matter-of-factly, the way he would have told them about a broken fence rail or a leaky section of roof. Something to deal with. Something manageable. He said it that way because he had learned, in the 2 years since Ruth died, that the pitch of his voice was the thing the children calibrated themselves against. And if he let his own fear into it, he would lose all 4 of them to panic inside of 30 seconds. I need you all to listen to me, and I need you to be calm. Can you do that? They looked at each other. Then they looked at him. Yes, Joseph said. The girls nodded. All right, Joseph, I need you to get the rope from the tack room and bring it out here. Nora, there's a jar of turpentine in the workshop. Bring that too. Don't spill it. What's the rope for? Lily asked. To tie off my arm up high. Slow down the spread. He had no real confidence that this would help, but it gave him something to ask for, and it gave the older children something to do, which was nearly as important. Annie was still staring at the marks on his wrist with enormous eyes, and Elias reached out with his good hand and pulled her close to his side. She pressed her face against his shirt and held on. You're going to be okay, she said, very quietly, like she was the one doing the reassuring. I'm going to try my best, he said, which was the most honest thing he could have told her. Mom. Joseph came back with the rope. Nora came back with the turpentine, and also, for reasons she didn't explain, a dish towel. Elias let Joseph tie a loose wrap of rope around his forearm above the bite, and he poured some of the turpentine over the wound because he'd once heard that it drew out poison. He had serious doubts about that, but the smell of it at least did something. Made him feel like he was taking action, which was something. The sun was still a couple of hours from setting when the shaking started. It began in his left hand, a fine tremor that he noticed only because he was watching for it. Then it spread up his arm. His mouth had gone dry and tasted like iron, and the swelling had moved past his elbow now. He sat on the porch steps with his back against the post and kept his breathing slow, and he watched the road. The road ran west, cutting through a shallow rise before it dropped down toward the valley, and eventually, after a very long way, became the track that led to Caldwell Creek. There was nothing on it. There was rarely anything on it. Elias had gone 3 weeks once without seeing another human being on that road, not counting his own children. Annie had fallen asleep against his side, which he was grateful for. Nora had taken Lily inside to start supper, something simple, and he could hear them through the window. Nora's low, patient voice explaining something, Lily asking a question every 30 seconds. Joseph sat on the bottom step with his arms around his knees, not saying anything, looking at the road. You don't have to watch with me, Elias said. I know. Might be a long night. I know. Joseph picked up a stick from the ground and turned it over in his hands. Doc Hargrove, if I took the bay mare fast as she can go, by the time you got there and back, the dark would have set in. You don't know that road after dark. He paused. And I'm not leaving you 4 without one of us able to stand up. Joseph was quiet for a moment. So we just wait. We wait. The shadows were getting long and the air was beginning to cool off the way it did in Montana, even in August. That sudden drop that reminded you how high you were and how quickly the country could turn, when Elias saw something move on the western rise. A shape. A horse. He blinked. His vision had been doing things in the last half hour that he didn't entirely trust, the edges of things going soft, colors washing out a little. So he waited until the shape got closer before he let himself believe it was real. It was a woman on a brown horse, riding at a steady walk, and she was carrying something across her saddlebow. He couldn't make out what it was from this distance. He couldn't make out much of anything about her except that she was riding alone, which out here, on this road, at this hour, was unusual. Someone's coming, Joseph said. I see it. They watched. She didn't speed up and she didn't slow down, just kept coming at that same unhurried pace, as if she had somewhere to be and intended to get there without rushing. When she was close enough that Elias could see she was maybe 30 years old, with dark hair tucked under a practical hat and a face that showed no particular alarm at the sight of a man slumped against his porch post with a swollen arm and a rope tied around it, she pulled the horse up at the gate and looked at him for a moment. Snake bite? She said. Rattler, he said. About 2 hours ago. She swung down from the horse in one clean motion, looped the reins around the gatepost, and came across the yard carrying the thing from her saddlebow. It was a cloth-wrapped parcel, he could see now, the kind you wrapped bread in to keep it warm. She came up the steps without being invited, crouched down in front of him, and took his arm. Her hands were dry and cool, and she turned the arm over and looked at the wound and the swelling and the rope without saying anything for a long moment. Then she looked up at him. "I'm Clara Whitmore," she said. "I was heading through to Caldwell Creek. Elias Mercer." "How do you feel, Mr. Mercer?" "I've had better afternoons." Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement. She looked at Joseph. "What's your name?" "Joseph. Joseph, I need 2 things, and I need them fast. First, I need a sharp knife, clean, if you have one. Second, I need whatever you've got that'll burn. Whiskey, if there is any. Medicinal spirits. Turpentine will do, if that's all." "We've got turpentine," Joseph said. "Already used some. Bring more." She was already working at the knot Joseph had tied in the rope, loosening it. "And bring a clean cloth. More than one if you can find them." Joseph was on his feet and through the door before she finished the sentence. Elias looked at her. "You know what you're doing?" "My father was a doctor," she said. "I wasn't allowed to practice, obviously, but I watched him work from the time I was 6, and I helped more than I was supposed to." She finished with the rope and set it aside. "This tourniquet's tied too tight, and it's been on too long. That does more harm than good after the first few minutes." "I didn't know that." Most people don't." She pressed 2 fingers against the pulse on the inside of his wrist, watching her own hand. "Your heart's beating fast, but it's steady. That's something." She looked at the punctures again. "Rattlers are bad, but they're not always fatal if you get to them in time. What matters now is getting some of the venom out and getting you a doctor tonight. Doctor's 11 miles away. Then we'd better hurry." She sat back on her heels and looked at him directly. "I'm going to make a cut. It's going to hurt. And then I'm going to do something else that's going to hurt more. And you're going to have to be very still." "All right," he said. "You're sure?" "Lady, I've got 4 children and no wife. I don't have the luxury of not being sure." Something changed in her face when he said that. Not pity. He'd have hated pity. Something else. Recognition, maybe, of the particular kind of fear that lives behind a statement like that. 4 children, she said. Oldest is 11. Youngest is 4. He tilted his head toward the door, where he could still hear Nora and Lily moving around in the kitchen. "Annie's asleep against me here. I'd rather she stay that way while you do whatever you're doing." Clara looked at the sleeping child, then back at him. "Understood," she said quietly. "I'll be quick, aunt." She was not gentle, but she was fast. Elias had expected it to be bad, and it was, but he'd bitten down on a piece of the dish towel Nora had inexplicably brought outside and concentrated on keeping still, and when it was done, she sat back and pressed a clean cloth against the wound with steady, practiced pressure. His shirt was soaked through and his teeth were chattering, and he felt, in some distant and analytical part of his mind, genuinely frightened. Not the sharp fear of the moment of the bite, but the slow, spreading fear of understanding exactly how bad his situation was. He had 4 children who needed him. He was the last thing standing between them and a county orphanage or the charity of relatives who'd made it quietly clear they had their own burdens. He could feel the venom in him like a slow fire working its way up his arm toward his heart, and he sat on his porch steps on a Tuesday evening in August in the year 1876 and thought very clearly, this cannot be how it ends. "Stay awake," Clara said. "I'm awake." "Talk to me. Tell me something about this land." "Why?" "Because I need to know you're still here." She glanced up. "And because I want to know what I'm looking at." So he talked. His voice came out rougher than he would have liked, and he lost his thread twice, but he told her about the 40 acres and the cattle he'd been building back up after a bad winter 2 years ago, and the creek that ran along the northern edge and went dry in July, which was a problem he hadn't solved, and the way the mountains looked in November when the first snow came down the slopes. He talked and she listened, keeping her hand steady on his arm. And the shadows got longer and Annie slept, and Joseph came back out and stood nearby with the quiet, contained anxiety of a boy trying very hard to act older than he was. When Clara finally looked up, her expression had settled into something resolved. "I'm going to ride to Caldwell Creek," she said. Tonight, now. There's enough light left if I push the horse. You don't know the road. Joseph's going to draw me a map, and I'm going to bring back your doctor. Elias started to say something, and she held up a hand. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking you'd rather have me here and send the boy, but the boy is 11, and that road has 2 crossings that are tricky in the dark, and I've been riding since before I could walk. She looked at Joseph. You're going to stay with your father. You're going to keep him awake and keep that cloth pressed on his arm, and you're going to do exactly what I'm going to tell you before I leave. Can you do that? Joseph's jaw set. Yes, ma'am. Good. She stood up and brushed off her skirt. First, that bread in the parcel. Make sure your sisters eat something tonight. Don't let them skip supper because they're scared. She looked at Elias. And you, I need your word that you'll stay sitting up and stay talking to this boy. You have it, Elias said. All right. She started for her horse, then stopped and turned back. Mr. Mercer. Elias. Elias. She said his name carefully, like she was making sure she had it right. I've never once left someone in worse shape than I found them. I don't intend to start tonight. He watched her untie her horse and swing up into the saddle, watched Joseph jog out to meet her and show her something on a scrap of paper he'd scratched out, watched her study it for 30 seconds and tuck it into her coat. And then she was moving, heading down the road at a pace that wasn't quite a gallop, but close. And the sound of her horse's hooves faded, and there was nothing but the wind coming off the mountains and his son sitting back down on the steps beside him. She'll get there, Joseph said. He said it the way people say things they are not entirely certain of but need to believe. I think she will, Elias said. Annie stirred against his side, mumbled something, and settled back into sleep. In the kitchen, Lily had started crying quietly, and Nora was talking to her in that low, patient voice. Elias leaned his head back against the porch post and watched the sky go from amber to deep blue, and he thought about Ruth, which he always tried not to do when he needed to be strong because thinking about Ruth made it hard to breathe. But he thought about her anyway, and about what she would have made of this strange, capable woman who had ridden out of nowhere and cut his arm open and then ridden back out into the dark without so much as asking what was in it for her. She would have liked her, he thought. Ruth always had a way of knowing which people were real and which ones were performing. She'd have taken one look at Clara Whitmore and known immediately. The night was long. Elias drifted in and out of something that wasn't quite sleep and wasn't quite consciousness, more like a gray space between the two, where sounds became strange and time moved unevenly. Joseph stayed beside him, talking sometimes and quiet other times, and at some point Nora came out with a blanket and put it around his shoulders without saying anything, and he thought she had her mother's hands, the way they moved, efficient and careful. At one point he said something he couldn't remember saying, and Joseph answered him, and he couldn't hear the words, but the voice was steady and close, and that was enough. He kept his hand pressed over the wound because that was what Clara had told him to do, and he had decided somewhere in the gray space to follow her instructions exactly and completely because she was the only plan he had. He was cold. He hadn't expected to be cold in August, but he was, deeply, bone-deep cold, and the blanket helped some and didn't help enough. Annie had woken up and cried for a little while, and then Nora had taken her inside, and sometime after that, Lily had come out and fallen asleep on the steps with her head on Joseph's leg, and Joseph had sat very still so as not to wake her. Elias looked at his son in the dark and thought about all the things he still needed to teach him. How to read a weather pattern off the mountains. How to mend fence properly, not just patch it, but mend it so it held. How to sit with a neighbor who'd had a bad year without turning it into a lesson or a comparison. How to lose something and keep going. That last one Joseph was already learning, which wasn't fair, but the frontier had never been particularly concerned with what was fair. Joseph, he said. His voice came out thick. I'm here, Pa. If something happens, it's not going to. Listen to me. A pause. I'm listening. Your sisters. Nora can handle herself, you know that. But she's going to need someone to tell her it's all right to need help sometimes. She doesn't know that yet. He stopped, gathered himself. And Lily. Lily's going to be fine. She's got more toughness in her than she looks like. But Annie is going to need... She's going to need someone to stay close to for a few years. You understand what I mean? Pa, stop. I'm not done. He waited. If it comes to that, write to your Aunt Helen in Billings. She's difficult, but she's honest, and she won't leave you to the county. Tell her I asked specifically. He paused. And tell her I said please, because she'll need to hear that from me to believe it. Joseph had gone very quiet. Did you hear me? Elias asked. I heard you. Joseph's voice was carefully controlled. But she's coming back. The woman is coming back with the doctor, and you're going to be fine. I know, I'm just saying. I know you are. A beat. Pa, she brought bread. Elias blinked. What? The woman. She had bread in that parcel. Fresh bread, still warm. She was riding through and she had fresh bread. He paused. Who carries fresh bread through the middle of nowhere at sunset? Someone who was heading somewhere for supper, I expect. She left it, Joseph said. She left the bread and rode off to get the doctor. Elias didn't know why that fact, of all things, lodged in his chest the way it did. Maybe because it was so ordinary. Not the medical knowledge, not the courage, not the quick thinking, but the bread, left behind on his porch, something warm and made by hand, left for strangers. Her name's Clara, Joseph said. I know. Clara Whitmore. I know, son. She said it like she wanted to make sure you'd remember. Elias closed his eyes. The cold was still there, but it had settled into something almost manageable, and the gray space was calling at him again. He let himself float at the edge of it and kept one hand on the porch post to remember where he was. He heard the horse before he saw the light. 2 horses, actually, moving fast on the road from the west, and then lantern light swinging and Joseph's voice saying something sharp and glad, and Lily waking up with a startled sound, and boots on the steps. Doc Hargrove was a small, sharp-faced man of 60 who wore his coat even in summer and smelled of liniment and coffee. He came up the steps with his bag and a lantern, and Clara Whitmore one step behind him, and he crouched down and looked at Elias's arm without preamble. How long ago? He said. Sundown, Elias said. Maybe a little before. She told me what she did. Was she accurate? Far as I know. Hargrove made a sound in the back of his throat that wasn't quite approval and wasn't quite the opposite. He opened his bag. You're going to feel worse before you feel better, he said. That's just how it works. But the fact that you're still coherent and talking is a reasonably good sign. Elias looked past him at Clara, who was standing back a little, letting the doctor work. She'd pushed her hat back and he could see that she'd ridden hard, the dust on her face, the way she was breathing like someone who'd been holding a lot of tension for a couple of hours and had only just been allowed to let it go. You made it, he said. I told you I would, she said. Road wasn't bad? Second crossing's a mess. I went through it at a walk and still got wet to the knee. She looked at his arm, at what Hargrove was doing with quiet, efficient movements. How are you feeling? Terrible, he said. Better than I was. She nodded. Something passed across her face. Relief, he thought, but she wasn't wearing it outwardly. It was in the set of her shoulders, the way they'd come down from somewhere near her ears. There's bread, Joseph said to her, suddenly, from the steps. He was still sitting there with Lily half asleep against him, and he said it like he was reminding her of something important. You left it. We didn't eat it yet. Clara looked at the boy, and then she did smile, properly, for the first time since she'd arrived. It was not a polished smile. It was a crooked, tired, genuine smile that changed her face entirely. Then let's go cut it, she said. Your sister's inside? Yes, ma'am. Come on, then. She looked at Elias and at Hargrove and seemed to do a quick calculation. Unless you need... I've got 'em, Hargrove said, not looking up. Go feed those children. They've had a long night. Clara followed Joseph through the door and Elias could hear them inside, Joseph's voice, and then Nora's, and then Lily patting in after them, and a moment later the sound of Annie waking up and asking a question, and Clara's voice answering, lower than the rest, patient and clear. Hargrove worked steadily, and Elias sat very still and let himself be worked on, and after a while the doctor sat back and looked at him with that sharp, assessing face. She did well, Hargrove said. He didn't specify who he meant, but he didn't need to. Most men would have done the wrong things and made it worse. She did the right things in the right order. He began putting instruments back in his bag. You're going to need rest. Real rest. Not frontier rest where you're back in the saddle in 3 days. 2 weeks minimum. I've got a ranch to run. You've also got children who need their father alive. Hargrove closed the bag. Whoever that woman is, you'd better hope she's got somewhere close to be for the next few weeks. You're going to need help. From inside came the sound of voices, and then, quietly, the sound of someone laughing. A child's laugh. Lily, he thought, or maybe Annie. And beneath it, lower and steadier, a sound he hadn't heard in his house in 2 years. A woman's voice, easy and unhurried, like it belonged there. Elias Mercer sat on his porch in the dark, with a doctor's hands wrapped around his arm and the smell of fresh bread coming through the open window, and he stared at the mountains in the distance and thought about the word belonging, about how a thing could be gone so completely that you stopped believing it was possible, and then come back in a shape you'd never have recognized. He was not, he thought, a man who believed in luck. He believed in hard work and preparation and endurance. But he also believed in the particular randomness of the frontier, in the way a single ordinary moment, a man reaching under a porch for a lost toy, could undo everything or remake it. He didn't know yet which this was going to be. He suspected, sitting there in the dark with the sound of his children's voices drifting through the window, that he was about to find out. Doc Hargrove left before dawn. He'd given Elias something for the pain. A small brown bottle he set on the porch railing with instructions that were clear and non-negotiable. And he'd changed the dressing on the wound and told Clara exactly what to watch for over the next 48 hours. Fever above a certain point, discoloration spreading past the elbow, any sign that Elias was having trouble swallowing. He listed these things the way a man lists them when he wants to make sure the person he's talking to is actually listening, and Clara listened with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who already knew most of it and was filling in the gaps. "You've done this before," Hargrove said. It wasn't quite a question. "My father was a physician," she said, "in Ohio. I assisted him from the time I was a girl until he passed. Why didn't you train formally?" Clara looked at him. "They didn't train women formally." Hargrove made that sound again, the one that wasn't quite approval and wasn't quite criticism, but acknowledged the existence of a fact without commenting on the justice of it. He picked up his bag. "Change the dressing twice a day. Keep the arm elevated when he sleeps. If the fever climbs past what I told you, send the boy to town immediately. Don't wait." "I understand." He looked at her for a moment. "You heading somewhere particular, Miss Whitmore? Before all this?" "Teaching position," she said. "Caldwell Creek. The school there needed someone for the fall term." "Harlan Prescott School." He nodded slowly. "That's 3 weeks off yet. Term doesn't start until September." "I know." He looked toward the house where the lantern was still burning in the front window, and then back at her. "These children are going to need someone capable for the next while. Their father can't be on his feet for 2 weeks at minimum, and from what I saw tonight, the oldest boy has been carrying too much already." "I know that too," Clara said. He seemed to decide something. He nodded once, picked up his bag, and walked to his horse without any further commentary on the subject, which she appreciated. She watched him ride out, and then she stood alone in the yard for a moment in the pre-dawn dark, listening to the quiet. It was a particular kind of quiet, the Montana frontier before sunrise. Not empty, full, actually, of small sounds that you had to be still to hear. The creak of the barn, something moving in the grass beyond the fence line, wind in the cottonwoods a quarter-mile north. She had grown up in Ohio, where the sounds were softer, more settled, where the land felt like it had already been decided. Out here, everything still felt provisional, like the country was still making up its mind about whether people belonged in it. She went back inside. Elias slept through most of the first day, which was what he needed and what his body demanded of him regardless of what he might have preferred. Clara put him in his bed with the arm elevated on a folded blanket and checked on him every 2 hours with the discipline of someone who had done night watches before and knew that consistency mattered more than intensity. In between, she ran the house. This was not a simple thing. The Mercer homestead was a working ranch, and a working ranch did not pause because the man running it had been laid low. There were cattle to check on, a water situation that was clearly a problem, She'd seen the dry creek bed that morning and understood immediately why Elias had mentioned it the night before. And 4 children who were hovering somewhere between frightened and trying hard not to show it. Joseph she put to work almost immediately, not because she was being unkind, but because she could see that he was the type of person who needed a task to hold on to. Idle waiting was worse for him than hard work. She sent him to check the fence line on the east pasture, a job he clearly knew how to do, and he went with visible relief. Nora was different. Nora watched everything Clara did with those dark, assessing eyes, and she helped, efficiently, competently, without being asked twice. But there was a reserve in her that Clara recognized. It was the reserve of a child who had trusted someone's presence and then had that presence removed, and who had decided, reasonably, that the safest approach was to withhold investment until permanence was established. Clara didn't push against it. She just let Nora be useful and thanked her specifically when she was, and didn't make any promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Lily was 6 and more transparent than her siblings. She followed Clara from room to room for most of the morning, not helping particularly, but not getting in the way either, just maintaining proximity. At one point, she tugged Clara's sleeve and said, with complete seriousness, "My mama used to braid hair. Do you know how?" "I do," Clara said. "Could you do mine?" "After the morning chores are done." Lily considered this. "That's fair," she said, in the tone of someone concluding a business negotiation, and went to find something useful to do. Annie was the one who gave Clara the most pause. She was 4, and she'd been 4 when Ruth Mercer died, which meant she didn't really remember her mother's. She had impressions, feelings, the ghost of a presence rather than a specific person. And because of that, she was, paradoxically, both the easiest and the hardest. Easy because she had no complicated grief architecture to navigate around. Hard because she was very small and had already learned, somewhere in her body if not her mind, that the people who were supposed to stay didn't always. She came and found Clara in the kitchen mid-morning and stood in the doorway looking at her. "Are you staying?" Annie asked. Clara set down the pot she was holding. "For now," she said carefully. "Your papa's sick and someone needs to help while he gets better." "But after he gets better?" "I'm not sure yet, sweetheart." Annie thought about this. "Okay," she said, in a small voice that made Clara feel about 4 different things at once. Then she came into the kitchen and pulled a stool up to the counter and said, "I can peel things, if they're not too hard." "That's useful," Clara said. "Let's find something for you to peel." Elias was awake in the afternoon, groggy and irritable and embarrassed by the irritability, which he kept trying to push down and kept failing. Clara brought him broth, and he ate it without complaint because he was genuinely hungry. And then she changed the dressing on his arm, which was not a comfortable process. And he bore that without complaint too, mostly by staring at the ceiling and breathing carefully. "How bad?" he asked when she was done. "Better than last night. Worse than it'll be in a week." She wrapped the clean cloth around his forearm with practiced efficiency. "The swelling started to come down at the edges. That's a good sign." "Hargrove get off all right?" "Before sunrise. He left instructions." Elias was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the ceiling, at the place where the plaster had cracked 2 winters ago, and he'd patched it with something that was holding but not beautifully. Everything about this house was like that, he thought. Holding but not beautifully. He'd meant to fix so many things when spring came, and then spring had turned into summer, and the cattle needed attention, and the fence line needed attention, and the children needed attention, and there was only one of him. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Clara." He glanced at her. "Clara, I'm not sure how to say this without sounding like I'm running you off, which I'm not, but I don't know your situation. Whether you've got people waiting on you or—" "I don't," she said. She said it without self-pity, just as information. "My father passed 2 years ago. I've been boarding in Helena since then, doing what work I could find. The teaching position in Caldwell Creek was the first permanent post I've been offered." She tied off the bandage. "The term doesn't start for 3 weeks. He looked at her steadily. "I can't pay you much." "I didn't ask to be paid." "I know, but I'm offering because I've got my pride and what's left of my dignity, and the only way I can ask for help is if I'm offering something in return." He paused. "I've got some cash put aside, not a lot, and there's board here, obviously, if you don't mind the conditions." Clara sat back and looked at him. "Your conditions are fine. The house is cold in the mornings, but it's solid, and the children are—" She stopped. "Are what?" She seemed to be choosing the word carefully. "Remarkable," she said. "Each one of them." Something moved across Elias's face that he didn't entirely control. He turned his head back toward the ceiling. "They've had to be," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "They have, and that's not entirely a compliment to the situation." He laughed at that. A short surprise sound, the kind that comes out before a person decides whether to allow it. "No," he said. "I suppose it's not." She stood up and smoothed her skirt. "Sleep more if you can. I'll bring supper in when it's ready." "Clara," she paused at the door. "Thank you," he said, "for last night, for staying, for—" He stopped, because there were too many things in that sentence, and he didn't have the energy to list them properly. "Get some sleep, Elias," she said, and pulled the door most of the way closed behind her. The first week was the hardest, not because of any single crisis. There was no single crisis, which was almost its own kind of difficulty. It was the accumulation of small, relentless demands that the ranch made on everyone still capable of standing up. The cattle needed water hauled because the creek was dry, which meant the barrel on the wagon and 2 trips a day to the spring a mile east, which was Joseph's job with Clara driving because Joseph couldn't manage the team alone. The garden needed attention, or there wouldn't be much worth canning for winter. The roof of the chicken coop had developed a gap that a hawk had already found once, and Nora had handled it with a piece of wood and a hammer and 3 bent nails before Clara even knew it was a problem. "You fixed it yourself?" Clara asked, looking at the repair. "Papa showed me last fall," Nora said. She shrugged. "It's not pretty." "It'll hold?" "Should." Clara looked at the girl. Nora was 9 years old, and she was standing in the chicken yard with sawdust on her dress and a hammer still in her hand, explaining her repair work with the careful detachment of someone who had learned not to seek approval too loudly. Clara wanted to say something about how capable she was, how impressive, but she had a feeling that particular kind of praise would land wrong, like it was surprised, like it was condescending. So instead she said, "Good call on the board size. That gap needed something with more width, or it would have warped open again." Nora looked at her. A pause. "Yeah," she said. "That's what I thought." It wasn't much, but it was something. Elias was up on the 3rd day, which was earlier than Hargrove had wanted and exactly what Clara had expected. She heard him in the kitchen before dawn and came out to find him standing at the window in his socks, looking out at the yard. "You're supposed to be in bed," she said. "I know." "Then why aren't you?" He turned around. He looked better than he had. The gray cast was gone from his skin, and the arm wasn't being held against his body the way it had been when every small movement caused a fresh wave of pain. But he was still pale, and there were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before the bite, and she suspected they weren't going to go away quickly. "I heard something in the barn," he said. "That was Joseph. He was up early with the horses." Elias looked at her. "He's been doing that? Getting up early with the horses?" "Every day." Something passed across his face, pride and guilt at the same time, in approximately equal measure. He turned back to the window. "He shouldn't have to—" "He knows that," Clara said. "He's doing it because he wants to. There's a difference." She came to the stove and moved the kettle over the heat. "Sit down." "I can stand." "I know you can stand. Sit down anyway." He sat, which surprised her a little. He didn't seem like a man who took direction easily. She put coffee on and pulled bread from the box where she'd been keeping it and cut 2 slices, and when she turned around he was watching her with an expression she couldn't entirely categorize. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He looked away. "You move like you know where things are." "I've been here a week." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "Ruth used to—" She had a way of making a kitchen feel occupied, like it was in use, like it was serving its purpose. I haven't—" He stopped. Clara set his coffee in front of him. She didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that would be either true or useful. She just set the coffee down and sat across from him. "The creek's not coming back this summer," she said. "I've been watching it. The spring's holding, but if August stays dry, you're going to have a problem by September." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup, carefully, keeping the bandaged arm from pressing against the table edge. "I've been thinking about digging it out further north. There's a spot where the water table's higher. Old-timer told me about it when we first came out here. Never had the time to look into it properly. Who'd dig it? Me, eventually. Once this... He lifted the arm slightly. 2 weeks minimum, Claire said. Doc said 2 weeks. I've heard of men healed faster. I've heard of men who thought they healed faster and then weren't. She held his gaze. You have 4 children, Elias. 2 weeks. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was not quite irritation and not quite amusement and contained elements of both. You know, he said, you're very comfortable telling people what to do. I am, she agreed. It's one of my less charming qualities. He laughed again, that same short, surprised sound as before, like laughter was something that caught him off guard when it came, something he hadn't entirely budgeted for. I didn't say it wasn't useful, he said. The neighbors started coming by at the end of the first week. This was, Clara understood, not entirely motivated by goodwill. Some of it was genuine. Marta Engel from the farm 4 miles south brought a pie and stayed for an hour, and was warm and uncomplicated in the way of a woman who has absorbed enough frontier hardship to have shed most of the social performances that weren't serving anyone. She shook Clara's hand at the door and said, I heard what you did. That took nerve, and that was the end of it. But others came with the particular quality of attention that was less about concern and more about information gathering. A man named Briggs, who ran cattle on the land adjacent to the north, came with his wife and spent most of his time looking around the yard and asking questions about Elias's recovery that sounded like they were about health, but felt like they were about capacity. Like he was trying to determine whether the Mercer operation was in a position to negotiate or a position to be taken advantage of. Clara disliked him on instinct, and then, because instinct wasn't fair, gave him the benefit of the doubt for approximately 20 minutes before deciding that instinct had been right. Mr. Mercer's doing well, she said, when Briggs asked for the third time in slightly different phrasing how much Elias was up and moving. He'll be back to full strength soon, certainly before anything on this property needs outside consideration. Briggs looked at her with the look of a man who has just been understood by someone he'd written off. His wife looked at her shoes. And you are, he started, Clara Whitmore. I'm helping with the household until Mr. Mercer is recovered. She smiled the specific kind of smile that contained no warmth whatsoever, but was technically a smile. Can I offer you both some coffee before you head back? They didn't stay for coffee. Nora had been watching from the kitchen window. When Clara came back inside, the girl was still at the window, and she turned around with those dark, evaluating eyes and said, He's been trying to buy our north pasture for 2 years. Papa won't sell. I figured it was something like that, Clara said. How? The way he kept asking about how sick your father was. She started putting the cups away. People who are just worried ask once and accept the answer. People who have a stake in the answer keep asking. Nora absorbed this. I didn't know that was a rule. It's not a rule exactly. More of a pattern. Clara glanced at her. You spotted it yourself, otherwise you wouldn't have been watching from the window. Nora turned this over. I suppose, she said slowly. They stood in the kitchen together for a moment, Nora still thinking, Clara putting cups back on their hooks. And it was the first time since Clara had arrived that the silence between them had felt like the same silence rather than 2 separate ones. But Elias was on his feet properly by the middle of the 2nd week. Not full strength, not even close, but functioning. He could do light work, check on the cattle, make decisions about things that needed deciding. The color had come back to his face, and he was sleeping normally, and the arm, when Clara changed the dressing, was healing with the steady, methodical progress of a body that had been properly treated and then given enough time. It's going to scar, she told him, on the day she determined that the wound had closed cleanly enough to leave off the twice daily changing. I figured, he said. Ugly scar or not so bad scar depends on what you do with the arm in the next month. You pull something heavy with it before it's ready, you'll tear the scar tissue and it'll heal wrong. I know how scar tissue works. I'm telling you anyway. He looked up at her from where he was sitting. You always tell people things they already know? I tell people things that are important, she said. Whether they already know them is secondary. He shook his head, but not in an unkind way. More like a man cataloging a feature of the landscape he keeps encountering. He turned the arm over and looked at the pink seam of the healing wound. Ruth used to say I was stubborn as a post, he said. I think she'd have found you interesting. Clara paused. This was the second time he'd mentioned Ruth to her directly, and both times had been careful and specific. Not grief spilled carelessly, but something offered deliberately, like he was deciding to include her in something rather than letting her find it on her own. What was she like? Clara asked. He thought about it. She was funnier than she seemed, he said. People took her seriously because she was serious, but she had a way of finding things funny that she kept mostly to herself. You had to be paying attention. He paused. She would have put Briggs off the property in under 5 minutes. Less diplomacy than you, but same result. I wasn't being diplomatic, Clara said. I was being precise. Is there a difference? Diplomacy leaves room for the other person to feel they might be right. Precision doesn't. He looked at her. Right, he said. Yeah, that's what you were doing. They were in the yard when they had this conversation. Elias sitting on the porch steps in the afternoon light, and Clara on the step beside him, and the children were out, Joseph at the fence line, Nora and Lily in the garden, Annie asleep inside. The ranch had a particular quality in the afternoon when the work of the morning was done and the work of the evening hadn't started yet, a brief pause where the land exhaled. Clara had started to recognize it as something to count on, that pause. Something to look forward to in the way she used to look forward to the 15 minutes after her father's last patient of the day, when the office would go quiet and he'd make tea and they'd sit and talk about nothing particularly important. She had not told Elias that she'd started to feel at home here. It didn't seem like the right thing to say. It wasn't the right thing to say. She was here temporarily, helping while he recovered, and in 10 days she was supposed to be setting up a classroom in Caldwell Creek and beginning the work she'd come here to do. She knew that. She reminded herself of it regularly. But the afternoon light was doing something particular to the mountains, turning them gold and deep purple at the same time, and the children's voices were coming from the garden, Nora and Lily arguing about something minor, the way sisters argue, the stakes low and the irritation genuine and the underlying current of it warm. And Clara sat on the porch step of a house she hadn't known existed 3 weeks ago, and felt, with a clarity that alarmed her a little, that she did not want to leave it. She said nothing about this to Elias. He seemed, however, to be thinking something adjacent to it. She could feel him working toward a question that he kept pulling back from, the conversational equivalent of a man pacing in front of a door he hasn't decided to knock on. She waited, because pushing wouldn't help, and she'd learned early that Elias Mercer said what he meant when he was ready, and not a moment before. The teaching position, he said finally. Was it something you've wanted a long time? Yes, she said. Teaching is what I'm suited for, what I'm trained for, such as it is. Such as it is? I educated myself mostly, read everything my father had in the house, which was considerable, took in what I could from the physicians who came through and would talk to me. She looked at the mountains. The world's not arranged for women who want to do things. You learn to come in sideways. Caldwell Creek's school, he said. That's 11 miles. I know. You'd be boarding in town then, during term. That's the arrangement, yes. A pause. The mountains went a deeper gold. Joseph asked me this morning, Elias said, whether you were going to stay. Clara looked at her hands. What did you tell him? I told him I didn't know. He was quiet for a moment. Which is the truth? I don't know. It's not my decision to make. He turned the scarred arm over in the fading light, looking at the healing seam. I know you came here by accident. I know this isn't what you were heading toward. No, she said. It wasn't. But you stayed. I stayed. Another pause. The pause stretched long enough that Clara became aware of how still everything was. The yard, the road, the mountains in the distance, even the arguing in the garden had stopped. Lily asked me if you'd do her hair again, he said. It came out sounding like something other than what the words meant on their surface, and they both understood that. Clara looked at him. He was looking at the mountains, not at her, which she suspected was deliberate, giving her somewhere to look that wasn't his face while she considered what she was going to say. I'll do it tomorrow morning, she said, before she goes out to help with the garden. Elias nodded. He didn't say anything else, and she didn't either, and they sat on the steps as the light shifted and the mountains went from gold to something darker. And somewhere inside the house, Annie woke up from her nap and called out, sleepy and uncertain. And Clara rose without thinking and went to answer her. She was halfway to the door before she realized she'd moved automatically, instinctively, the way you move towards something that belongs to you. She stopped for just a moment in the doorway, her hand on the frame. Behind her, Elias said nothing, but she heard him shift on the step, and the quality of the silence that followed was not the silence of a man who had noticed nothing. She went inside. Annie was sitting up in the small bed in the corner room, her hair in disarray and her eyes still soft with sleep, and she looked at Clara with the simple, unguarded recognition of a 4-year-old who has already decided, in the uncomplicated way of small children, where her safety lives. "You're here," Annie said. "I'm here," Clara said. She sat on the edge of the bed and smoothed the child's hair and listened to the house settle around her. The creak of Elias on the porch steps, the voices coming back up from the garden, the specific sound the kitchen made in the afternoon when the stove had cooled and the light came in at an angle through the west window. She listened to all of it, and she did not let herself think about what it would sound like in 10 days when she wasn't here to hear it. She just sat there, and she was present. And for now that was enough, and also it was not enough at all. And both those things were true at the same time, which was the most human kind of situation there was. The 10 days passed the way hard things sometimes do, faster than they should have, and with a quality of unreality that Clara only recognized in retrospect when she was standing in front of her open saddlebag trying to decide what to pack first and finding that her hands wouldn't cooperate. She told herself it would be simple. She had a position. She had an obligation. She had spent 2 years in Helena taking in mending and tutoring the children of merchants and waiting for something like this teaching post to open up, and it had, and she was going to it. That was the shape of her life, and it was a reasonable shape, one she'd constructed deliberately out of the materials available to her. She folded a blouse, put it in the bag, took it back out because she'd folded it wrong and she needed something to do correctly. Outside the window, the morning was clear and cool, the kind of August morning that reminded you September was coming whether you were ready or not. She could hear Joseph and Elias in the yard. Something about the fence line, a section that needed replacing before winter, the particular back and forth of a man and his son who had learned to work alongside each other. She could hear Nora in the kitchen starting breakfast, the sound of the stove being loaded and the pan finding its place on the grate. She could hear Lily singing something to herself on the porch, the words not quite coherent but the tune recognizable. One of the songs Clara had hummed while braiding her hair 3 days ago that had apparently lodged in the girl's memory and taken up residence there. She could not hear Annie, which meant Annie was either still asleep or was doing something she didn't want to be caught doing. Clara set the blouse down and put both hands flat on the dresser and looked at herself in the small mirror above it. The woman looking back at her was 31 years old and had spent the last 2 weeks doing the most purposeful work she'd done since her father's last illness. She looked tired in the way of someone who has been genuinely used up by something that mattered, which was different from the tired of the boarding house in Helena, the tired of waiting for her life to arrange itself into a shape that fit. She picked up the blouse and folded it again, correctly this time. Breakfast was a performance of normalcy that nobody quite pulled off. Elias was too quiet. He'd been that way for 3 days. Since the conversation on the steps, since the afternoon with the gold light on the mountains, since the moment they'd both understood something without saying it, and then agreed silently to let it sit there unaddressed. He ate his eggs and said the right things to the children, and once refilled her coffee cup without being asked, which was such a small gesture that it should not have meant anything, and which she found she could not stop thinking about. Joseph ate fast and left early. He said he had to check the spring, which was probably true, and also probably not the only reason. Nora ate with deliberate attention to her plate, which was what Nora did when she was thinking hard about something she wasn't going to say. Lily talked enough for all of them, describing in extensive detail a dream she'd had about a horse that could talk and what she would say to it if she met one, which bought them all about 12 minutes of cover. Annie had in fact been doing something she didn't want to be caught doing. She arrived at the breakfast table with her hands behind her back and her expression arranged into the particular mask of innocent unconcern that 4-year-olds deploy when they have done something they know falls into a gray area. She sat down. She ate. When Clara got up to clear the plates, Annie produced from behind her back a small, slightly crushed wildflower, the yellow kind that grew in the dry grass on the west side of the pasture, and held it out. "It's for you," she said. Clara looked at the flower. It had been picked with some urgency and handled without great care, and two of its petals were already on their way to separated. She took it with both hands. "Thank you, Annie." "So you remember us," Annie said, "when you're gone." The kitchen went very quiet. Even Lily stopped talking. Clara crouched down so she was level with the child. Annie's face was completely serious, the way small children's faces are when they are saying the exact thing they mean without any of the protective layering that older people put around meaning. "I'm going to remember you," Clara said. "All of you. That doesn't need a flower, but I'm glad to have it." Annie studied her for a moment. Then she seemed to reach some internal conclusion and climbed down from her stool and went to find her shoes, because that was all she'd needed to say. Clara straightened up. She did not look at Elias. She carried the crushed yellow flower to the window ledge and set it there in the morning light, and she washed the plates, and she listened to the kitchen come back to its ordinary sounds. She had the horse packed by mid-morning. Not the saddlebag, that was done. The saddlebag was on the horse, which was tied at the fence post nearest the road, and Clara was making a final pass through the house to make sure she hadn't left anything essential and hadn't taken anything that wasn't hers, both of which were the kinds of mistakes you made when your mind was elsewhere. Nora found her in the small room where she'd been sleeping. She stood in the doorway without quite coming in, which was very Nora. Present but not presumptuous, attentive without being intrusive. Clara had come to read this particular positioning of hers as the signal that she had something to say, and was deciding whether to say it. "You can come in," Claire said. Nora came in. She looked at the bare surface of the dresser where Clara's few things had sat for 2 weeks. The hairbrush, the small book, the 2 extra hairpins that always ended up somewhere they weren't supposed to be. She looked at the neatly made bed. "Lily's upset," Nora said. "She's not going to show it, but she is." "I know," Clara said. "I'll say goodbye properly." Nora nodded. A pause, then, "I didn't think I liked you at first." Clara looked at her. "I know that too." "It wasn't about you specifically." Nora's voice was careful, working through something she'd been composing for a while. "After Mama died, there were people who came and said they'd help, and then—" She stopped. "They didn't stay. Or they stayed for the wrong reasons. Mrs. Porter from church, she came twice a week for a month, and she was kind, but she kept looking at Papa in a way that made Joseph uncomfortable. And then when it didn't go the way she was hoping, she stopped coming." Nora's jaw set. "I got tired of people who came for reasons that weren't us." Clara was quiet for a moment. "That's a reasonable thing to get tired of," she said. "You came for no reason at all," Nora said, "just because you were there and it was a bad situation. More or less. Nora seemed to be trying to find the right word for something. "That's the only kind of person that's worth having around. The ones who stay because they don't think about whether to stay. They just do." It was an astonishing thing for a 9-year-old to say, and the fact that it was also true made it more astonishing and not less. Clara looked at this girl with her dark eyes and her mother's chin and her father's stubborn practicality, and thought about all the grief she'd processed into competence, all the fear she'd turned into watchfulness, and felt something that she usually kept at arm's length move closer than it was supposed to. "Nora," she said. "I'm not asking you to stay," Nora said quickly. "I know you have your position. I know you've got your own life. She stopped again. "I just wanted you to know that I noticed. The real kind of reason you came." Clara crossed the room and put her arms around the girl, briefly and without making it into more than it was. Nora held still for a moment, surprised probably that she hadn't pulled away, and then, carefully, she put one arm back. They stayed like that for about 3 seconds. Then Clara let go and Nora straightened up, and they both looked at the bare dresser as if they'd been doing something perfectly ordinary. "I'll say goodbye to Lily," Clara said. "She's out by the garden," Nora said. Her voice was its usual steady self again. "She's pretending to weed." Elias was at the fence post where her horse was tied. He'd come around from the barn and was now doing something with the latch that didn't need doing, which she recognized as the same impulse that made her refold the blouse. Something to do with the hands, while the mind worked at something harder. She came across the yard, and he stopped pretending to work the latch and turned around. He looked at her horse. He looked at the saddlebag. He looked at the road running west, which was the road she'd ridden in on 3 weeks ago, and which was the road she was now going to ride back out on. Horses rested, he said. Yes. Road's dry. That second crossing will be no trouble in the daylight. I know the crossing, she said. I know. He looked at his boots for a moment. There was something working in his face. She could see it from 10 feet away. Something that he was trying to arrange into the proper shape before it came out. Clara. Elias. I've been trying for 3 days to figure out how to say something without it coming out wrong. He looked up. His face was not a face that gave things away easily. It was the face of a man who had spent 2 years keeping himself together by keeping himself contained. But right now the containment had a visible strain to it, like a wall that has water behind it. I'm not good at this. I'll tell you that up front. Ruth used to say I could be standing in the middle of a burning building and still not ask for help until I'd tried to put it out myself first. That tracks, Clara said. Yeah. A breath. You've been here 3 weeks, and in that time what you've done for this family, I can't. He stopped, started again. Joseph slept through the night for the first time in months, the week after you got here. He told me that. Nora fixed the coop without being asked and came to me after to tell me about it, instead of just going quiet the way she does. Lily smiles more. Annie, he stopped and looked at the road again. Annie woke up this morning, and when she came to the kitchen, she didn't go to the corner the way she usually does. She went straight to where you were standing, and she just stood there, like that was a place that was safe. Clara's hands were still at her sides. She was keeping them still deliberately. Elias, she started. I'm not done. He said it quietly, not as an interruption. I know what you're going to say, that you have a position, that you've got your own life to get to, that you came by accident and you stayed because the situation required it, and now the situation doesn't require it anymore. He looked at her directly. And all of that is true. I know it's all true. Then, but I also know that you set that flower on the window ledge, he said. And you knew why Annie gave it to you. And you stayed through that breakfast this morning instead of leaving after the bags were packed, which was when the practical thing would have been to go. He paused. You stayed for breakfast. Clara looked at him. There was a long pause, the kind that has weight to it. I stayed for breakfast, she said. That means something. To me, it means something. He reached up and scrubbed one hand across the back of his neck, a gesture she'd seen him make when he was uncomfortable but pushing through the discomfort anyway. I'm not asking you to give up the teaching position. I'm not asking you to... I don't even know what I'm asking exactly. I just know that when I think about you riding down that road, I feel the same thing I felt when I was sitting on those steps with snake venom in my arm. He looked at her, like I'm about to lose something I didn't know I needed until I had it. The road was empty, and the mountains were clear and blue, and the morning was doing the thing Montana mornings did in August, where the air was still cool enough to be grateful for. Clara looked at this man, imperfect, stubborn, grieving in the specific way of people who've had to keep functioning through grief and so have never quite gotten to the bottom of it. And she thought about Nora's words in the bedroom. The ones who stay because they don't think about whether to stay, they just do. She had thought about whether to stay. She'd been thinking about it for 3 days. She'd thought about it while she folded and refolded the blouse, while she set the flower on the window ledge, while she ate breakfast with people who were not her family and who felt more like her family than anything had in 2 years. I'm afraid, she said, and because Elias had put something real in front of her, she gave something real back, which was what he deserved. Not of this, not of you, or the children, or any of this specifically. She gestured toward the house, the yard, the mountains behind it. I'm afraid of what it means when it stops being temporary. When I stop being the woman who rode in to help and become someone who... She stopped. Someone who belongs here, he said. Yes. She looked at him. Because if I belong here and then something... She stopped again. He waited. The children have already lost one person who belonged here, she said. And I know that's not a reason to never let anything be real. I know that. But knowing it and feeling it are different things, And what I feel is afraid of being another person who they need and then don't have. Elias was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at the fence post, at the latch he'd been pretending to fix. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Yes." I said the same thing to myself, after Ruth. I said, "The children need to be protected from more loss, so I need to keep everything at a distance. Keep it manageable. Keep it from mattering so much that it can hurt them." He paused. "You know what that got us? Joseph, who wouldn't sleep. Nora, who fixed things alone and never said a word about it. Lily, who forgot to sing. And Annie, who stood in the corner of every room she was in, like she was waiting for permission to take up space." He looked at her. Protecting them from loss didn't protect them from anything. It just made the loss that was already there bigger and quieter. Clara closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, the mountains were still there, solid and indifferent and beautiful. "The teaching position," she said. "Caldwell Creek is 11 miles, he said. "School term is 9 months. The summer's yours, and a classroom full of children isn't the worst thing for a woman who—" He stopped himself. "That's your decision. I'm not telling you what your work is worth." "It's worth a great deal," she said. "I know it is." He met her eyes. "I'm not asking you to choose between this and that. I'm asking you whether there's a version of this where both things exist." It was the most careful thing she'd ever heard a man say about a woman's life that wasn't his own, and the carefulness of it undid something in her chest that had been wound tight for the better part of 3 weeks. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't know what that looks like yet." "Neither do I," he said. "But I'd rather try to figure it out than watch you ride down that road and spend the next 9 months wondering." From the direction of the house came Lily's voice, calling something. Not urgently, just calling in the way children call to locate themselves relative to the people they're counting on. And beneath it, closer, the low sound of Nora's answer. Clara looked at the horse. She looked at the saddlebag. She looked at the road going west toward Caldwell Creek, and a classroom and a life she'd planned carefully and waited 2 years to get to. Then she looked at Elias Mercer, who was standing at a fence post in his yard with a badly healed arm and an honest face and 4 children inside the house behind him, and who had just asked her the question with both hands open and no pressure in them whatsoever, which was the only way the question could have been asked that would have had any chance of working. She didn't say yes, not yet. What she said was, "I need to go to Caldwell Creek." His face shifted. "To talk to Harlan Prescott," she said, "about the terms of the position." A pause. Something in his face worked through several stages rapidly. "About whether there's a version," she said, "where both things exist." He let out a breath. It was not dramatic, not a grand exhalation of relief. It was a quiet breath, the kind a man releases when he's been holding something for 3 days and has finally been given a reason to put it down. "Okay," he said. "I'm not promising anything," she said. "I need to see what's possible before I can promise anything." "I understand." She untied the horse from the fence post. She put one foot in the stirrup and swung up, and then she looked down at him from the saddle. "Elias." "Yeah." "For what it's worth, the burning building thing, the asking for help." She looked at him steadily. "You asked." He looked up at her. A pause. "I suppose I did." She turned the horse and started down the road. She did not look back, not because she was practicing some kind of emotional discipline, but because she was looking at the road and thinking about what she was going to say to Harlan Prescott when she got to Caldwell Creek, and the conversation she was constructing in her mind required all of her attention. She was 200 yards down the road when she heard Annie's voice from the porch, high and clear across the morning air. "She's coming back, Papa." She couldn't hear Elias's response, but she heard the certainty in Annie's voice, the matter-of-fact, unquestioning certainty of a 4-year-old who has decided something and sees no reason to doubt it. And she found, to her own surprise, that the certainty wasn't wrong. The road bent west and the ranch disappeared behind the rise, and Clara Whitmore rode toward Caldwell Creek with her back straight and her mind working and a slightly crushed yellow wildflower tucked carefully into the breast pocket of her coat, where it would stay for the entire 11-mile ride without her once thinking to take it out. Harlan Prescott was not what she'd expected. She'd built a version of him in her mind over the months of correspondence, formal letters, precise and careful, discussing curriculum requirements and classroom conditions and the terms of her boarding arrangement. She'd assembled him from those letters into a man who was probably 60, probably fussy, probably the kind of school administrator who'd hired her out of desperation for qualified applicants, and would spend the first month finding polite ways to question her judgment. He was 45, direct in the manner of a man who ran a school on a tight budget and couldn't afford to waste time on indirection, and he listened to what she said across the desk in his small office above the hardware store. Listened completely, without interruption, which was rarer than it should have been. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You want to board out at the Mercer place," he said. "I want to know whether the position requires otherwise," she said. "Whether there's a boarding stipulation I've overlooked." He looked at the papers on his desk. He looked at her. "The arrangement we discussed was for you to board with the Hendersons in town. That's the traditional arrangement." "I understand. I'm asking whether it's required by the school or whether it's simply the traditional arrangement." Prescott tapped one finger on the desk twice. "The school requires reliable attendance," he said. 5 days a week, weather permitting. It requires a teacher who is present and functional and not distracted by circumstances that compromise the quality of instruction. He looked at her. 11 miles is a hard ride in the Montana winter, Miss Whitmore." "I'd board in town during the week," she said. "I'm not proposing to ride 11 miles in a blizzard on a Tuesday. I'm proposing that the weekends and the summers and the terms of my personal arrangement, that those be my own business." Prescott looked at her for a long moment. He had the look of a man reassessing something he'd made up his mind about. "Mercer's a good man," he said finally. "Rough year." "Yes." "Those children—" He stopped. "They were in school here, the 2 older ones, before their mother passed. Mercer pulled them out to help on the ranch. I always thought that was a loss for them." "It was necessary," Clara said, "and they haven't lost as much ground as you might think. Joseph reads above his level. Nora can calculate faster than she lets on." Prescott's eyebrows went up. "You've been teaching them." "I've been around them. There's a difference." She paused. "Though I wouldn't object to the overlap continuing." He looked at her for another long moment, and she could see him weighing things. Practicalities, precedents, the particular brand of frontier pragmatism that overrode convention when convention wasn't serving anyone. "The Henderson arrangement will need to stand for the school week," he said. "Reputation of the school, parents' expectations, the usual reasons." He held up a hand before she could speak. "But what you do with a Friday evening through a Monday morning is your own business, Miss Whitmore, and frankly always has been. I'm a school administrator, not a warden." Clara let herself breathe. "Thank you, Mr. Prescott." "Don't thank me yet," he said, with the faint dryness of a man who has been running a frontier school for 15 years. "Come see the classroom before you decide anything. It needs work. I want you to see it clearly before you commit." She saw it clearly. It needed work. She committed anyway, with her eyes open and her mind already sorting what could be fixed before September and what would have to wait until spring. On the way out, Prescott stopped her at the door. "Mercer know you're here?" he asked. "He knows I rode to Caldwell Creek," she said. "He doesn't know exactly what I'm doing here." Prescott nodded slowly. "When you get back," he said, "tell him the Henderson girl, Sarah Henderson, boards with her grandmother on the North Road. She's ready to try reading again if someone has patience for her. She's been struggling since 3rd grade, and the previous teacher gave up on her too early." He paused. "You seem like someone with patience." Clara looked at him. "I'll tell him," she said, "if I get the chance." She rode back east. The afternoon was longer than the morning had been. The light different, coming from the other direction now, the mountains catching it in a way that was specific to the return trip. She'd noticed this on other rides. The country looked different going home. She stopped at the second crossing, where the road dipped down to where the water ran shallow over flat stones, and she let the horse drink, and she sat there for a while. The water was low after the dry summer, barely moving, and the sound it made was small and constant and without urgency. A kingfisher sat on a branch above the creek and looked at her without any particular concern. She thought about what she was riding toward. Not the house, not the specific faces and voices of it. She'd been thinking about those for 11 miles and didn't need to think harder. She thought about the word Nora had used, belongs. The ones who stay because they don't think about whether to stay. She'd thought about whether to stay. She'd thought about it with great care and precision and had arrived, by a route that was neither simple nor clean, at what felt like the honest answer. She clicked to the horse and they crossed the water and came up the other side into the afternoon. And the mountains were ahead of her now, large and real and not going anywhere. And the road ran east between the dry grass and the fence lines toward a ranch she could not yet see but could already feel, the particular weight of a place that had been added to the list of things that mattered. She was not ready to say she was sure of anything. She was not a person who said she was sure of things she wasn't sure of. But she was riding east, and she was not riding slowly, and the yellow wildflower was still in her pocket. And by the time the sun was 2 hours from setting, she could see the roofline of the Mercer house on the rise, and below it, sitting on the porch steps in the exact place she'd last seen him, a figure that resolved itself as she got closer into a man who was doing nothing at all, just sitting in the late afternoon quiet, looking at the road. He had been waiting. She rode through the gate and he stood up from the steps, and he didn't say anything, and she didn't either, because there wasn't yet a language for what they were in the middle of, and making one up on the spot seemed like a way to get it wrong. She swung down from the horse and stood in the yard and looked at him. Prescott agreed, she said. School week's in town. The rest is mine. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face that he didn't try to contain this time, didn't pull back and contain the way he usually did. He just let it be there. All right, he said. I'm not making promises I can't keep, she said. That's the one thing I need you to understand. I'm not going to promise you things that depend on how the future goes, because nobody knows how the future goes. I know that. But I'm staying, she said, through the summer and through the school year, and she stopped. I'm staying, Elias. From inside the house came the sound of 4 children, the specific acoustic chaos of them, overlapping and distinct, Lily's voice above the rest of it, asking someone something that apparently required an immediate answer. The screen door banged open and Annie appeared on the porch, still in yesterday's dress because she always forgot to change until someone reminded her, and she saw Clara in the yard and her face did the thing it did when something matched what she'd been expecting. I told you, she said, to no one in particular. I told you she was coming back. Clara looked at the child. She looked at Elias. The afternoon light was doing the thing it did. The gold and the deep purple and the mountains going from blue to something darker at their edges. And the house behind him was not beautiful and not finished and not any of the things a house in a book would be, and everything about it was imperfect and real and hers, or close enough to hers, that the distinction had become something she was prepared to work on. Come on, Annie, she said, and started toward the porch. Let's find you a different dress. The remaining weeks of August moved differently than the ones before. Before, there had been the shape of a countdown underneath everything. Clara's departure, a fixed point on the horizon that organized each day around itself, gave every meal and every evening and every conversation on the porch steps a quality of being temporary, of existing in borrowed time. Now that shape was gone, and what replaced it was something less defined, and, in its own way, harder to navigate. Not because it was worse, because it was real in a way that borrowed time never quite is, and real things require a different kind of attention. The first difficulty was practical, which was almost a relief because practical difficulties had solutions you could work on. Clara was staying, but the question of exactly what that meant, what her position in the household was, what the neighbors would make of it, what the children were to be told, and how, was a question that the frontier did not leave you much time to answer at your own pace. The frontier had opinions, and the frontier expressed them through the specific medium of other people showing up unannounced. Marta Engel came by on a Wednesday, 4 days after Clara's return from Caldwell Creek. She came ostensibly to bring a second pie, which was either a coincidence or the most transparent piece of reconnaissance Clara had ever witnessed. She sat at the kitchen table and ate coffee and looked at Clara and at Elias, and at the way they occupied the same space, not touching, not doing anything that could be described in precise terms, but occupying the space with the particular ease of people who had made some kind of agreement. And when she left, she squeezed Clara's hand at the door and said, very quietly, "Good." And that was all. Briggs came by on a Friday. He didn't bring anything. He stood in the yard and talked to Elias about cattle prices and water rights and the dry summer, and the entire time he was talking, he kept glancing toward the house in the specific way of a man trying to determine whether a situation has resolved itself in a direction he'd been hoping to exploit. Clara watched from the kitchen window without being subtle about it, which she figured Briggs could see, and which she figured was not a bad thing for him to know. After Briggs left, Elias came inside and poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the counter drinking it. "He's going to keep coming around," Clara said. "He's been coming around for 2 years," Elias said. "It's what he does. He wants the north pasture. I know what he wants." "What's on the north pasture that he wants so badly?" Elias looked at her over the rim of the cup. "Water. There's a spring up there that doesn't go dry. His land's got nothing. He hauls in from the creek same as us, but his herd is 3 times the size of mine, and he's been watching that pasture since we settled here." He set the cup down. "He made an offer 6 months after Ruth died. Not a bad offer, financially. I turned it down." "Why?" "Because he made it 6 months after Ruth died," Elias said, "when he figured I was at my lowest and most likely to take whatever I could get." He looked at the window. "A man who waits to offer you something until you're on your knees isn't making you an offer. He's making an extraction." Clara looked at him. "You should fence it," she said. "The north pasture. If you've got a spring that doesn't go dry, that's your most valuable asset. Make it clear it's in active use." "That takes money I don't currently have." "How much?" He named a figure. It was not a small figure, but it was not an impossible one. Clara did the arithmetic in her head. The teaching salary, the months before the term started, what she'd saved in Helena. She didn't say anything about the arithmetic yet, because there was a right time for that conversation, and this wasn't it, but she filed the number away. "I'll think about fencing," Elias said. He picked up his cup. "You don't have to solve everything at once." "I know I don't." You do know that, right? That you're allowed to be here without immediately fixing every problem on the property?" She looked at him. "I'm not very good at that." "I noticed." He said it without irritation, just as a fact. Then he almost smiled. "Neither am I, so I'm probably not the best person to be telling you." This was the other difficulty, the one that was less practical and therefore harder. They were 2 people who had arrived at something real by an indirect and unexpected route, and neither of them was naturally inclined to move slowly or to let things simply be what they were without trying to understand them completely and immediately. They kept having conversations that weren't quite the conversation, circling the actual subject with the careful orbiting of 2 people who had both been burned before in different ways and were therefore cautious about direct approach. The children, in their various ways, were less patient with this. Plus, it was Joseph who forced the issue, which surprised Clara and probably should not have. He'd been watching the 2 adults in the house with the same focused attention he turned on everything, the fence line, the cattle, the weather, and after about a week of watching, he apparently reached a conclusion and decided to act on it. He came to Clara on a Sunday evening when Elias was out doing the last check on the stock, and he sat down at the kitchen table across from her with the air of a person who has prepared what he wants to say. "Are you going to marry him?" he asked. Clara set down what she was doing. She looked at Joseph, 11 years old, lean and serious, with 2 years of shouldered responsibility written into the set of his jaw. She gave the question the respect it deserved. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "That's a decision that takes time." "How much time?" "Joseph, I'm not trying to push you," he said, and he wasn't. His voice was level, just asking. "I'm asking because I want to know how to think about things. If you're going to be here and then not be here, that's one way to think about things. If you're going to stay and it's going to be permanent, that's a different way." Clara looked at him carefully. "Who taught you to think like that?" He shrugged. "Nobody. After Mama, I started paying attention to what things actually are versus what people say they are. Because sometimes they're different, and if you don't know which is which, you get caught off guard." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a hard thing to have learned." "Maybe." He looked at his hands. "Is it going to be permanent?" She thought about what to say. She thought about what was actually true, as opposed to what was careful or measured or hedged against future uncertainty. "I intend it to be," she said. "That's the truest answer I can give you." Joseph absorbed this. He nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "Does that help?" "Yeah." He stood up. "He's not going to ask you, you know. He'll wait too long, and then it'll be winter, and then he'll say it's too complicated to think about during winter, and then—" "Joseph." He stopped. "I'm aware of your father's tendencies," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then something shifted in his face. something young and involuntary, the expression of a boy who had been managing things alone for too long and had just been handed the particular relief of not being the most competent person in the room. "Okay," he said again, and then he went back outside, and Clara sat at the kitchen table alone for a few minutes. And when she heard Elias coming back across the yard, she stood up and met him at the door. He came in with the smell of the evening on him, hay and dust, and the particular sharpness of the night air coming down off the mountains. And he was going to say something about the stock. She could see it, some ordinary information about the state of the world. And before he could, she said, "I think we should get married." The ordinary information did not come out. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. "Before the school term," she said. "Before September. There's no practical reason to wait, and there are several practical reasons not to." He kept looking at her. "You were going to wait too long," she said. "I'm told this is a pattern." "Who told you that?" "Someone who knows you well." A pause. His expression was doing several things at once, surprise and something that might have been sheepishness, and underneath both of those, something that was neither, something that didn't have a simple name. He came all the way inside and closed the door behind him. "I was going to ask you," he said. "I know. I got there first." "Clara." "Elias." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes," in the straightforward way of a man saying the most important word he's said in years without any performance around it. Not a speech, just yes. "All right," she said. "Then let's tell the children." They told the children at breakfast. Elias said it plainly, the way he did things, that he and Clara were going to get married before September, and that this would make Clara a permanent member of the family, and he wanted to know how everyone felt about that. He phrased it as a genuine question, not a formality, because he was the kind of father who asked genuine questions and then actually waited for the answers. Lily's response was immediate and comprehensive. She knocked over her cup getting up from the table. It was water, not milk, which Clara had been quietly grateful for. And she said, "I knew it, I knew it, I knew it," at a volume considerably above what the kitchen required. And then she sat back down and righted the cup with the dignity of someone pretending the previous 5 seconds had not occurred. Annie looked at her father, and then at Clara, and then back at her father. "Does that mean she's our mama?" she asked. The kitchen was very quiet. Elias looked at Clara. Clara looked at Annie. "It means I'm here," Clara said carefully, "and I'm staying. What you call me is your choice, yours and your sister's and Joseph's. There's no wrong answer." Annie seemed to find this acceptable. She picked up her fork and went back to her breakfast with the serene practicality of a 4-year-old who has gotten the information she needed and is now ready to move on. The question of what to call her she appeared to consider a problem for later. Nora said nothing during all of this. Clara had been watching her from the corner of her eye. Nora always came last to things because she came most carefully, and the fact that she wasn't saying anything was not the same as not having an opinion. She ate her breakfast and watched the table, and when she finally looked up, it was at Clara directly, not at her father. "You're going to keep teaching?" she asked. "Yes," Clara said. "That was always the plan." "And you'll be in town during the week?" "During the school week, yes. Here for the weekends and the summers and everything else." Nora was quiet for another moment. Then, "Joseph and I should be in school." Elias looked at her. "Nora." "I'm not saying it to cause trouble," Nora said, in the even voice she used when she wanted it known that she was not causing trouble. She was raising a factual point. "I'm saying we're behind. And if Clara's teaching in Caldwell Creek and we're not in school, that's—" She paused. "That seems like a waste." There was a silence at the table. "She's right," Joseph said quietly. He said it to his plate, not making it into a confrontation. "I'm 2 years behind where I should be. Nora's further back than she'd be if she'd stayed." Elias set down his fork. This was, Clara could see, something he already knew, and had been not addressing in the way he not addressed things that made him feel like he'd failed, by burying it under the practicalities that had made it necessary. The ranch had needed them. There had been no one else. "Harlan Prescott mentioned both of you," Clara said. "Specifically." She looked at Elias. "He said he hoped they'd come back, that the older two especially had been missed." Elias looked at Joseph, and then at Nora, and then at the table. He breathed in slowly. "The ranch still needs hands," he said. "Mornings and afternoons." "We can do both," Joseph said. "Before school and after. I've been doing it anyway, minus the school part." Elias looked at his son for a long moment. Joseph held his gaze steadily, not challenging, just present. Finally, Elias nodded once, the nod of a man conceding a point he should have conceded earlier and knows it. "We'll work out the schedule," he said. Nora went back to her breakfast, but Clara caught the brief expression that crossed the girl's face before it went back to its usual composure. Not triumph, nothing as simple as that. Something quieter. The look of someone who has been waiting to be taken seriously and has finally been. They were married on the last Saturday of August. It was not a large wedding, there was no money or time for large, and neither of them had particularly wanted it. Marta Engel came and brought her husband Carl, a taciturn man who expressed approval through the quantity of his handshake and who shook Elias's hand for what seemed like an unusually long time. Harlan Prescott came, which surprised Clara and seemed to surprise Elias too, but he stood at the back and nodded at her when she looked his way, and that was the sum of his sentiment on the matter. Doc Hargrove came, which did not surprise either of them. He arrived with a wedding gift that turned out to be a medical reference text, the kind that cost more than it should have, with a note tucked inside that said only, "For the woman who already knew most of this." She thought it was the best gift she'd ever received. The ceremony itself was performed by a justice of the peace from Caldwell Creek, a man named Abernathy who was competent and businesslike and got through the legal requirements in under 10 minutes, which suited everyone present. The part that stuck with Clara, the part that she would come back to later, not with the soft nostalgia of a thing remembered, but with the specific clarity of a moment that had been genuinely real, was not any particular thing said or done in the formal part. It was after, standing in the yard in the late August heat with the mountains behind the house going gold and blue, Elias's hand in hers, not the deliberate, self-conscious gesture of newlyweds performing for observers, but the simple grip of two people standing next to each other, the grip that happens before you think about it. And Annie appearing at her side without announcement and sliding a hand into Clara's free one, the same hand she'd extended every morning for the past 3 weeks when they went from the house to the yard, the entirely automatic gesture of a child who has decided where her safe place is. Clara looked down at Annie's hand in hers. She looked up at the mountains. She did not feel that her life had arrived somewhere, because she was not that kind of romantic. She felt that her life had changed direction, and that the direction was honest, and that honest was as much as you could reasonably ask for. Marta Engel appeared at her elbow. "You look like you're doing arithmetic," she said. "I do that," Clara said. "Stop for today," Marta said. "The arithmetic will keep." September came and Clara rode to Caldwell Creek on a Monday morning with her teaching materials and a week's worth of clothing and the very specific anxiety of someone beginning a job they have wanted for a long time and are now, confronted with the reality of it, terrified of getting wrong. The school was a single-room building on the east end of town, unpainted, with windows that let in an encouraging amount of light and a stove that would need work before winter. She stood in the doorway on that first morning and looked at 18 children between the ages of 6 and 14, sitting at desks with the wary assessment of students who have had teachers before and are reserving judgment on this one. She was not naturally nervous in front of groups. What made her nervous was something harder to name, the particular weight of knowing that what happened in this room mattered, that some of these children would remember this year for the rest of their lives, and that the quality of that memory was partly her responsibility. She set her materials on the desk and looked at the room. "My name is Clara Mercer," she said. "I'm going to teach you things this year that you'll use for the rest of your lives, and some things that seem impractical right now but will make sense later, and probably some things that won't make sense ever, but we'll do our best with all of it." She paused. "I also intend to teach you how to ask good questions. Because a good question is worth more than most answers. If you're going to remember one thing about this year, that's what I'd choose." She saw, in the second row, a girl of about 12 with her eyes down and her hands in her lap, with the specific posture of someone who had been told, explicitly or otherwise, that she was not good at this. Clara thought about what Prescott had said. The Henderson girl. ready to try if someone had patience. "Let's start," Clara said, "with what you already know. Because you all know more than you think you do, and I'd rather find out what that is than spend the year assuming you know nothing." The first week was hard in the way first weeks are. Finding the level of each student, identifying what had been taught wrong or not taught at all, determining which children were bored and which were struggling and which were so accustomed to being invisible in a classroom that they had perfected the art of appearing to be neither. Clara came back to the ranch on Friday evening tired in a way that went into her bones. The productive exhaustion of someone who has spent 5 days being completely present for other people. Elias had supper on the table. This was not something she'd asked for or expected, and she stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment looking at it. The table set, the pot on the stove, Lily and Annie setting out the cups with great concentration, Nora slicing bread. "You cooked," she said. "Nora cooked," Elias said, from where he was coming in from the back. "I mostly stayed out of the way." "He burned the onions," Lily reported, without looking up from the cups. "I did burn the onions," Elias agreed. "I took them out," Nora said. "She saved it," Elias said. Clara looked at this scene, at the imperfect, negotiated, smoke-faintly scented evidence of 4 people who had spent a week learning to manage without her, and had mostly succeeded. And she felt something that she didn't have a clean word for. Not sentimental exactly, more like structural. Like something had been built that was load-bearing. She sat down at the table. Annie climbed into the chair beside her automatically, the way she always did. Joseph came in from outside with hay still on his jacket and sat across from Clara and said, "How was school?" with the directness of someone who actually wanted to know. She told them about the week. She told them about the Henderson girl, whose name was Sarah, and who had stayed after school on Thursday and read 3 pages out loud with only 2 mistakes, and had looked up, afterward, with the expression of someone who has just discovered that a thing they'd been told they couldn't do was, in fact, something they could do. Clara told it plainly, without embellishment, and she watched Joseph listen with the focused attention of a boy who knew something about being behind and catching up, and she watched Nora's expression shift in the subtle way it shifted when she was connecting something to her own experience. "Is she going to be okay?" Lily asked about Sarah Henderson. "Yes," Clara said. "She just needed someone to slow down for her." Lily nodded, satisfied, and went back to her supper. After the children were in bed, Clara sat at the kitchen table with the lamp low and the week's papers spread in front of her, making notes about each student, what they knew, what they needed, what approach seemed to be reaching them. Elias came in from the last check on the barn and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her without asking, the way he'd started doing, the small, unremarked gestures that accumulate into a habit, and from a habit into a language. He sat across from her and looked at the papers. "How are they really?" he said. "The students?" "All of it. School, the week, coming back here, all of it." She looked up from the papers. It was a genuine question. Not how are you performing, but how are you? She'd learned to distinguish between the two with him. They were not always the same. "Hard," she said, "and worth it. Both true at once." "That's most things," he said. "Yes." She looked at her papers. "I need to get Joseph and Nora enrolled before October. Prescott's been flexible, but I don't want to push the goodwill." "I know. We talked about it this week, the 3 of us. Elias paused. "He's ready. He's been ready. I'm the one who was—" Another pause. "I kept thinking if they were in school, I was admitting the ranch couldn't run with just me, which was already true. I just didn't want to say it." Clara looked at him. "It's true of every ranch," she said. "You can't run 40 acres alone. Nobody can." "I know that now." "Did you know it before?" He thought about it. "I knew it, but I thought it was a failure I should be able to fix by working harder." "And now?" "Now I think working harder is sometimes the wrong tool." He looked at his coffee. "I had a neighbor growing up, old man named Casper, had 300 acres and ran it with his wife and 6 sons. Most productive farm in the county. People used to say he was lucky to have all those boys." He paused. He wasn't lucky. He built that. He understood that more people working together make something different from what one person working alone can make, and he built toward that deliberately. He looked up. "I didn't understand that until—" He stopped. Until I saw what this looked like," he said. This specific week. Coming in from the barn tonight and seeing the kitchen and hearing the noise of them and knowing you were going to come through the door. He looked at her steadily. It doesn't look like one man working harder. It looks different from that. Clara set down her pen. She looked at her husband across the kitchen table in the lamplight. This man she had known for not quite 2 months. This man she had cut open and bandaged and argued with and listened to on a porch at sunset. This man who had asked for help with both hands open and had not, in her considered judgment, fully understood what he was asking for. "Elias?" she said. "Yeah." "When we fenced the north pasture," she said. He looked at her. Then he laughed, genuinely, the kind that came from somewhere real. "You've been sitting on that since the Briggs conversation." "I have an amount saved," she said, "from Helena. It's not a fortune, but it's close to the number you mentioned, and I'd like it to be useful." "Clara, it's ours," she said. "If we're doing this the actual way, the whole way, then it's ours, both the problems and the means to address them." She held his gaze. "The north pasture, the fence, the spring, we do it before winter and we own the strongest asset on this section of land, and Briggs can come around as often as he likes, and the answer will always be the same." Elias looked at her for a long moment. He was doing the thing where he worked through an argument toward the acceptance he'd already privately reached. She'd learned to wait for it. "Before winter," he said finally. "We'd have to start soon." "Next month," she said. "After the school week. Weekends." Clara, that's hard work." "I know what hard work is," she said. He nodded slowly. Not the surrender nod, not the nod of a man who's been won over. The nod of a man who has just recognized something he already knew and is acknowledging it properly. "Yeah," he said, "you do." They sat in the kitchen until the lamp burned low, and Clara went back to her student notes, and Elias went back to whatever he was calculating in his head about timber and post holes and the logistics of a fence line. And the house was quiet around them, the specific quiet of 4 sleeping children and 2 people working by lamplight. And outside, the Montana autumn was coming down off the mountains in slow, patient increments, the air sharpening, the nights longer, the first suggestion of what winter would mean arriving in the way it always did, not all at once, but piece by piece, like a truth you already know settling into certainty. When Clara finally put down her pen, Elias was still at the table. "You should sleep," she said. "So should you." "I asked first." He looked at her with that expression that was not quite a smile but had all the warmth of one, the expression she had learned to read in the weeks since August as his version of something most people made obvious. "All right," he said. "Come on then." They turned out the lamp. In the morning, Clara would ride back to Caldwell Creek and stand in front of 18 children and do the work she was built for. And in the evenings, she would return to a house that was imperfect and unfinished and filled to the edges with the particular noise of a real family. And the fence on the north pasture would go up board by board on the weekends until it was done, and Briggs would come by in October and read the new fence line and turn his horse around without stopping. And Nora and Joseph would walk into the Caldwell Creek schoolroom in the second week of October with their chins up and their mother's composure and their father's stubbornness, and Sarah Henderson would read an entire chapter out loud by November without stopping once to apologize for herself. None of that had happened yet. But it was all coming. The way things come when the right people are in the right place doing the actual work, instead of waiting for conditions to be easier. The lamp went out. The house settled. In the corner room, Annie was asleep with her arm around the rag doll she'd had since she was 2, and she was not standing in any corner of any room waiting for permission to take up space. And the word she would use in 6 weeks' time, quietly and without announcement. The first time she used it was Mom. And it would come out so naturally that no one would mark the exact moment it happened, which was exactly as it should be. The fence went up in October, as planned, and not without difficulty. The ground on the north pasture was harder than Elias had expected, a shelf of rock running beneath the soil at inconsistent depths that turned a straightforward post hole into a negotiation with the earth. And the earth was not inclined to be cooperative. They lost 2 weekends to rain that turned the slope above the spring into something too treacherous to work on safely. And they lost a Saturday to a section of the existing barn roof that chose that particular morning to develop a leak of sufficient urgency that everything else had to wait. But by the 3rd week of October, the fence line was done. Not pretty. The posts weren't perfectly spaced, and there was one section along the northeastern corner where Elias had run short of timber and had to splice in a different grade of wood that would need replacing in 2 or 3 years, but it was solid, and it was there, running along the boundary of the north pasture from the cottonwood stand to the rocky rise above the spring, and it said what it needed to say. Briggs came by on a Tuesday in November, the way he always did. He rode the fence line from the road, taking his time, and Elias stood at the gate and watched him do it without going out to meet him. When Briggs finally rode over, his expression had the specific flatness of a man who has been outmaneuvered and is deciding how to respond to that information. "Nice fence," he said. "Thank you," Elias said. A pause. "Spring holding up this late in the season?" "Better than the creek." Another pause. Briggs looked at the house, at the smoke coming from the chimney, at the yard which had the ordered, functional quality of a place being actively maintained. He looked back at Elias. "You've had some changes," he said. "Some," Elias said. "Seems to be working out." "Seems to be?" Briggs nodded slowly, the nod of a man recalibrating his assessment of a situation he'd misread. He turned his horse. "Tell your wife hello," he said, and rode back out the way he'd come. Elias stood at the gate and watched him go and did not feel what he'd expected to feel, which was something triumphant. What he felt was more ordinary than that, the quiet satisfaction of a problem that had resolved itself through persistence rather than confrontation, the way most real problems did when you waited them out and did the work in the meantime. He went back inside, where Clara had heard the whole thing from the kitchen window and was standing at the stove pretending to check on something that didn't need checking. "He said hello," Elias told her. "I heard," she said. "He's not coming back. Not for a while." She turned around. "Good," she said, in the exact same tone Marta Engel had used at the wedding, and for a moment the similarity of it struck Elias as so precisely right that he had to look away before his face did something he hadn't decided to let it do. The first winter was hard, because Montana winters were hard, and no amount of preparation or optimism changed the fundamental nature of the season. The temperature dropped in December in the way that it dropped out here. Not gradually, but in one decisive shift, like a door closing, and afterward the world was a different place than it had been before. The cattle needed constant attention. There were mornings when the water in the barrel froze before dawn and had to be broken through before the animals could drink. And there were days when the wind off the mountains was cold enough to be a physical force, something you leaned into and moved through rather than simply walked in. Elias and Joseph did the heavy morning work together, and they were out before light most days and back in when the light was going, and the rhythm of it was brutal, but it was also in some way that neither of them said out loud, something they had both needed. The time beside each other in the cold and the dark, working toward the same thing, not talking much, but talking when it mattered. Joseph turned 12 in December. Clara made him a cake, which was not a simple production in a kitchen where the flour supply was a matter of careful arithmetic, and she did it without making it into a ceremony of sacrifice. Just made the cake and put it on the table and said happy birthday to the boy who was not yet a man and was no longer quite a child, and who sat at the table that evening in the lamplight with his cake and his family around him, and was, for the duration of that evening, just 12. Nora thrived in school in the way of someone who had been waiting without knowing it for the thing that fit her. She was not the easiest student. She asked more questions than the other children, and some of those questions were the kind that made Clara stop and think before answering, which was occasionally inconvenient in a classroom setting, and was also, Clara thought privately, the best possible sign. A child who asked questions that were hard to answer quickly was a child whose mind was moving faster than the material. The task was to keep the material moving fast enough. "She argued with me today," Clara told Elias in February, after a school week that had left her with the particular buzzing energy of someone who had been genuinely challenged. "Nora?" "She told me my explanation of long division was incomplete." Elias looked at her. "Was it?" Clara paused. "It was technically correct, but she found a case it didn't account for, an edge case, and she sat there and worked it through on her own slate, and then brought it up to me after the other children had gone." "What did you tell her?" "I told her she was right," Clara said, "and that the complete rule was more complicated than I'd given them, and that I'd simplified it because most students at her level don't need the full version yet." She paused. She asked why I hadn't told them it was simplified. Why I'd presented it as the whole thing. Elias was quiet for a moment. What did you say? I said it was a reasonable criticism and that I'd do better. She looked at him. And then I was irritated about it for about an hour, and then I realized I was irritated because she was right. Elias almost laughed. She's 9. She's 10 now, and yes, Clara shook her head. She's going to be formidable. She's already formidable. More formidable. Clara looked at the fire. She needs more than I can give her in a one-room schoolhouse. Eventually. Not yet, but she needs more. This was the beginning of a conversation that would take 2 years to fully develop, but once Clara named it, it didn't go back into the category of unspoken things. It lived there in the house, a fact that would need addressing when addressing became possible. The frontier way often was to know a thing clearly and carry it carefully and wait until the ground was solid enough to build on. Lily at 6 was exactly who she'd been at the beginning, and also more of it, which was the way growth worked in children who'd found their footing. She was talkative, dramatic, fiercely loyal to anyone she'd decided deserved loyalty, and occasionally exhausting in the specific way of a child who experiences everything at full volume. She had taken to calling Clara Mom without event or ceremony, the word simply appearing in her sentences one day in November as if it had always been there, and the only remarkable thing about it was how unremarkable it turned out to be. Annie had been the first, technically. 6 weeks after the wedding, on an ordinary Wednesday, she had said Mom to get Clara's attention from across the kitchen, and Clara had turned around and Annie had looked at her with those clear, direct eyes and said, "Can I have more water?" The request so ordinary, the word so natural, that Clara had poured the water and handed it over before the weight of what had just happened fully arrived. She'd gone outside after that, briefly, on the pretext of checking something in the yard, and stood in the cold October air for 2 minutes with her hand against the porch post. Not crying exactly, something adjacent to crying that was also something else, the feeling of a thing you'd been trying not to hope for so hard that when it happened you hadn't made room for it and had to find the room quickly. She went back inside. Annie was drinking her water and didn't look up. That was how it went, out here. The things that mattered happened without announcement, and the announcement caught up later, if ever. The second year was better than the first, which was what you worked toward. Not perfection, just improvement. The incremental movement of a situation in a direction you'd chosen. Elias dug out the spring properly in the spring of 1878, with Joseph's help and 2 days of brutal work that left both of them with blistered hands and sore backs. And the result was a clean, reliable water source that didn't depend on the creek's cooperation. It changed the character of the North pasture entirely. Elias expanded the herd by 12 head, carefully, within what the land could support, and by the end of the year the ranch was producing enough to cover its costs with a margin left over that hadn't existed before. This margin was not large. It was enough to fix the roof properly, the whole roof, not just the section that leaked, and to replace the barn door that had been hanging wrong since the previous winter, and to order the specific book that Nora had asked about in a tone of such careful casualness that Clara had understood immediately she'd been wanting it for months. "How did you know about this book?" Clara asked when it arrived, and she gave it to Nora. Nora looked at the cover. It was a natural philosophy text, considerably above a 10-year-old's expected level. Prescott mentioned it. I asked him about it, and he told me the title. "You asked Prescott?" He seemed like someone who knew about books. She turned it over in her hands. "He said it was too advanced for me." "What did you say?" "I said I'd let him know once I'd read it." She opened it to the first page. "Thank you," she added, with the slight delay of someone who'd been raised to remember manners but was already somewhere else in her head. Clara watched her and felt the familiar mix of things that Nora reliably produced in her. Exasperation and affection, and something that was genuinely close to awe. This girl was going to do something with her life that nobody in this county had anticipated, and the best thing Clara could do was get out of the way and make sure the path stayed clear. She said as much to Elias that evening. "I know," he said. "She'll need to go somewhere with a proper school eventually. Billings, maybe. Or further. I know that too. How do you feel about that?" He thought about it in the honest way he thought about hard things. "Proud," he said. "Scared." The same way I felt when Joseph told me he wanted to try his hand at the Donner Place's draft operation, see how the bigger herds were run. He paused. I keep thinking my job is to hold them here, but I think my actual job is to build them to the point where they can go. Clara looked at him. That's well put. Don't act surprised, he said. She smiled. I'm not surprised. I'm just noting it for the record. Okay. In the spring of 1879, Clara found out she was pregnant. She told Elias on a Sunday morning before the children were up, in the kitchen with the coffee barely made and the light still new, and she said it plainly because that was how she said things. And he sat with it for a moment in the way he sat with news that was large, not processing it aloud, not immediately, but absorbing it inward first. Then he looked at her and said, Are you all right? Not are you happy, not this is wonderful, not any of the things a person says when they want to establish the correct emotional tone of a moment. Just, are you all right? Which was exactly the question, and which told her, as such questions do, something true about the person asking it. Yes, she said. Yes, I wasn't expecting it this soon. Neither was I. He paused. Does it change things for the school? I'll teach through the summer term. I'll need to stop before December, probably. She looked at her coffee. Prescott is going to have to find someone. He'll manage. He'll be annoyed. He'll manage anyway. Elias reached across the table and put his hand over hers, briefly, without making it into a statement. We'll figure out what comes next. I know, she said. I'm not worried. I'm just recalibrating. He nodded. He understood recalibrating. He'd been doing it, in one form or another, since August of 1876. The children took the news in October, when it was visible enough to explain. Lily's response was characteristically immediate. She wanted to know if it was a boy or girl, and when told that nobody knew yet, seemed to find this a failure of planning on someone's part. Annie wanted to know if the new baby would sleep in her room. Joseph said congratulations with a handshake that was so deliberate and adult that Clara had to work to keep her expression level. Nora said nothing for a few minutes, and then looked at Clara with a directness that had become familiar. You're not going to stop teaching permanently, she said. It wasn't a question. No, Clara said. Eventually I'll go back, when things settle. Nora nodded once, satisfied. The thing she'd been checking on was confirmed. What Clara didn't say, because the time wasn't right yet, was that she'd already spoken to Prescott about something larger, about whether the school might expand, whether there was appetite in the county for a proper two-room schoolhouse that could serve older students with more advanced material. Prescott had listened, which she'd learned was his version of enthusiasm. He'd said he'd think about it. She'd said she'd be ready to help make the case when thinking became planning. That conversation was still years away from completion, but it existed, a thing in progress, which was how most worthwhile things were. Their son was born in January 1880, in the middle of a snowstorm that kept Doc Hargrove at the ranch for 2 days, and they named him Robert, which had been Clara's father's name, and Elias said yes to this immediately and without hesitation, which was one of the things she stored in the category of things she knew to be true about him. Robert was a loud, vigorous, aggressively healthy baby who slept badly and ate constantly and had Elias's red hair from the first week, which Lily found hilarious and told everyone she met. He was passed from sibling to sibling with the practiced confidence of a household that had long since established its own internal logic, and Annie in particular took to him with the intense proprietorial affection of a 5-year-old who has identified a creature smaller than herself and has decided it is her responsibility. Clara watched her family with the newborn and thought about how nothing about any of this had been planned. Not the rattlesnake, not the ride in the dark, not the 11 miles of road between the ranch and Caldwell Creek that had turned out to be something other than a distance. Not the teaching position that had bent around the shape of a family instead of the family bending around the teaching position. Not the North Pasture fence, or Nora's edge case, or the word mom appearing in Annie's mouth one ordinary Wednesday in October. None of it planned. All of it built, piece by piece, by people who kept showing up and doing the work. By 1882, the Mercer Ranch was not the largest operation in that part of Montana, but it was one of the more solvent ones, which on the frontier was the distinction that actually mattered. The herd was healthy, the spring was reliable, the North Pasture was producing, and the barn door hung level. There were still things that needed doing. There were always things that needed doing. That was the nature of the enterprise. But the list had changed character. It was no longer a list of urgent repairs, things that would cause collapse, if not addressed immediately. It had become a list of improvements, things that would make something already functional into something better. This was a different relationship with a list. Claire had learned to recognize the difference. Joseph was 15 and had grown into the ranch the way some people grow into a thing that fits them. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just by incremental accumulation of knowledge and competence, until one day you looked up and realized the shape had set. He was not going to be a rancher only. He had the mind for figures and the patience for complex problems, and Elias had started taking him to the bank in Caldwell Creek when there was business to discuss. Not because he needed a companion, but because he wanted his son to understand that the ranch was a financial entity as well as a physical one, and that understanding that difference was the work of years. He argued with the bank manager, Elias told Clara after one such trip. Joseph? Politely. About the interest rate on the spring expansion loan. Said he'd worked out the comparable rates from 2 other banks, and the current rate wasn't competitive. Clara looked at her husband. Was he right? Elias looked back at her. The manager gave us a better rate. She let herself smile. Nora's going to ask me how he knew to do that. I'll tell her I have no idea, Elias said, which is more or less the truth. Nora at 13 was formidable in the way Clara had predicted, and also in ways she hadn't. She had finished everything Caldwell Creek School could offer her by the time she was 11, and had spent the subsequent 2 years essentially educating herself with whatever Clara and Prescott could source for her, which was an imperfect solution, and which everyone knew was temporary. The question of what came next was no longer a question sitting quietly in the corner of a conversation. It had moved to the center of the table. It was Nora who moved it there, explicitly, on a November evening in 1882 when the family was at supper, and she set down her fork and said, I'd like to go to the Billings Academy in the fall. The table went quiet in the way tables go quiet when something has been said that everyone knew was coming and is still, somehow, surprising in its arrival. Tell me what you know about it, Elias said. Nora told him. She had done her research with the thoroughness of a person who does not raise subjects until she is prepared to discuss them completely, and she had written to the academy 2 months prior and had received information about admission, terms, costs, and the curriculum. She laid it out across the supper table the way she'd laid out her edge case on Clara's desk 3 years ago. Factual, organized, with the underlying current of someone who knows she's right and is giving the other person the tools to reach the same conclusion independently. Elias listened without interrupting. This was one of the things Clara had come to rely on in him. The capacity to listen to a difficult thing without immediately defending against it. He'd learned it, she thought, the way most useful capacities are learned, through necessity and grief and the gradual erosion of the impulse to protect himself from what he didn't want to hear. When Nora finished, he was quiet for a moment. It's expensive, he said. I know the number, Nora said. I looked at the ranch accounts. Joseph made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. You looked at the... Elias stopped, recalibrated. Of course you did. He looked at Clara. Clara looked at Nora. The accounts are accurate, she said. It's within reach. Not comfortably, but within reach. I'll work during summers, Nora said. Whatever's useful. I'm not asking to be funded without contributing. I know you're not, Elias said. That's not the question. He looked at his daughter, who was 13 and who held his gaze without flinching, who had his stubbornness and her mother's humor and the specific quality of attention that Clara had recognized from the first week as something that needed more room than a one-room schoolhouse could provide. The question is whether you're ready. I've been ready, Nora said, not unkindly, for 2 years. Elias looked at her, then he picked up his fork. I'll write to them in the spring, he said. Give me time to review the terms properly. That's fair, Nora said, and went back to her supper with the composure of someone who has concluded a successful negotiation and sees no reason to press further. Under the table, Lily found Clara's hand and squeezed it once, quickly, and Clara squeezed back, and neither of them said anything about it. Nora left for Billings in September of 1883. She was 14 years old, and she stood in the yard with her trunk packed and her face arranged into the composure she'd been practicing since she was old enough to know that showing fear was optional, and she hugged each sibling in order. Joseph, Lily, Annie, Robert, who was 3, and who clung to her leg briefly, and then let go with the philosophical acceptance of a toddler for whom departure was still an abstract concept. She hugged Clara last, or rather Clara held her, which was different. Held her the way she'd held her that day in the bedroom, briefly and without ceremony, except this time it lasted a few seconds longer, and Nora held on with both arms, and without the careful self-consciousness of a 9-year-old who hadn't yet decided how much she was allowed to need. "You're ready," Clara said, into her hair, quietly. "I know," Nora said, also quietly. "Right when you get there." "I will." She pulled back, straightened her coat, looked at her father. Elias looked at his daughter for a long moment. This person who had come out of grief and necessity and 2 years of fixing things alone and not saying a word about it, and who was now going out into a larger world with a trunk and a mind and the particular quality of readiness that no one had given her and no one could take away. "Be difficult," he said. Nora almost smiled. "Always," she said. She climbed up into the wagon, and Joseph drove her to Caldwell Creek to meet the stage, and Clara stood in the yard until the wagon was out of sight, and then she went inside and helped Robert find the toy he'd been looking for. And the morning continued, because mornings did. It was Elias who said it, eventually, on a winter evening in 1884, 8 years after a rattlesnake had struck his arm under the porch on a late August afternoon. They were in the kitchen, which was where they usually ended up, the kitchen being the room that had witnessed most of the real conversations of their lives together. Robert was asleep. Lily and Annie were in the back room doing whatever Lily and Annie did in the back room in the evenings, which involved a level of giggling that suggested nothing educational. Joseph had his own room now, a small addition Elias and he had built together the previous spring, and he was in it with his accounts, doing the kind of meticulous work he'd grown into so naturally that no one in the family could quite remember the point at which it had become his. Elias was at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, looking at nothing in particular. "What are you thinking about?" Clara asked. She was mending something. There was always something to mend, and she said it without looking up, the easy question of people who have shared enough space that silence requires no maintenance, but is sometimes worth checking on. "The porch," he said. She looked up. "The porch?" "That afternoon." He turned the cup in his hands. "I keep thinking, and I know this is a strange thing to think, I keep thinking about what I was reaching for under the porch when the snake got me." She waited. "It was Annie's wooden horse," he said. "The painted one Ruth had made for her the winter before she died. Annie had been crying about it for 2 days, said she'd lost it, and I'd seen it under the edge of the porch that morning." He paused. "I went to get it after supper. Didn't think twice about reaching under there. Just wanted to stop her from crying." Clara was very still. "I've thought about that a lot," he said. "About how it was such a nothing thing, an ordinary thing, the kind of thing you do 100 times without any significance attached. And it led to," he gestured vaguely at the kitchen, the house, the whole assembled life of it. "All of this." "Are you saying you're grateful for the snake bite?" Clara asked. "No," he said. "I'm saying I'm grateful for what followed it." He looked at her. "There's a difference. The snake was just a snake. It didn't mean anything, and it didn't cause anything except a lot of pain and a very bad night." He paused. "What caused all of this was you stopping, on that road, with that bread." Clara set down the mending. "You didn't have to stop," he said. "That's the thing I come back to. You had somewhere to be. You had your whole careful plan for your life. You could have ridden past a man slumped against his porch and told yourself it wasn't your problem, and that would have been a completely reasonable response." He looked at the cold coffee. "Why did you stop?" She thought about it. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because she wanted to give him the true one rather than the easy one. "I wasn't thinking about whether to," she said. "I just did." She paused. "I saw that something was wrong, and I stopped. And then I was there, and once you're there, you can either help or you can leave. And I didn't want to leave." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's all?" That's all. He was quiet for a while. Outside, the wind was doing the thing it did in January, the persistent low pressure of it against the walls. The sound that had become over 8 winters something she no longer heard as threatening, but as familiar. The house, imperfect and unfinished and built into solidity year by year, held against it the way things hold when they've been properly tended. I've been trying to figure out what the lesson is, Elias said. The thing this whole story teaches, and I keep coming back to the same thing. What's that? That the biggest things in a life don't come from the big decisions, he said. They come from the small ones, the ones you make before you think about them. He set the cup down. You stopped because you stopped. Not because you decided to be brave or because you'd calculated the situation and determined that stopping was the optimal choice. You just did it. He paused. And I asked for help because I asked, not because I'd overcome some significant personal barrier, because you were standing there and it seemed necessary. He looked at her. All of it. Everything after. It came from 2 people doing the ordinary thing in the moment they were in. Clara looked at this man who had learned to say true things after years of keeping them inside. This man whose arm bore a pale, crooked scar that she had seen every day for 8 years. This man who had asked for help with both hands open and had not yet fully understood what he was asking for and had gotten it anyway. You know what's strange, she said. What? I think about that bread sometimes, that I'd been carrying it all day and I left it there. She almost smiled. And I was annoyed about it, actually, for a moment after I rode off. Because it was good bread and I'd made it myself and it was for Mrs. Hartwell in Caldwell Creek, who'd been kind enough to promise me supper, and I'd left it with strangers and I wasn't going to get any of it. Elias stared at her. That's what you were thinking? I was thinking about the bread for about 2 minutes, she said. And then I was thinking about the road and the dark and the crossings, and that was it. He looked at her for a moment, and then he laughed. Not the short, surprise laugh of a man caught off guard by humor, but a full, genuine laugh. The kind that came from somewhere deep and real and had warmth all the way through it. The kind of laugh that said, I know you, and knowing you is one of the good things. The greatest gift, he said, when it had settled, and you were annoyed about the bread. I was briefly annoyed about the bread, she said, and then I stopped because there were more important things to pay attention to. She picked up the mending again. That's basically my whole approach to life, if you want to know. He picked up the cold coffee and drank it anyway, which he always did, because he hated wasting things, and which she had stopped trying to change because some things about a person were not improvements, they were just them. Nora's coming home in June, he said. I know. Joseph's been talking about expanding the herd operation north of the creek, if the price of beef holds. I know that too. Annie asked me last week if she could learn to ride properly. Said Lily's a better rider and she wants to fix that. Clara looked up. She said that? She said Lily's better than me and I don't like it. Those exact words. Clara thought about the 4-year-old who had stood in corners waiting for permission to take up space, who had handed her a crushed yellow wildflower and said, So you remember us. Good, she said. Tell her yes. Already did. They sat in the kitchen while the wind pushed against the walls and the house held, and Robert made a small sound in his sleep and then went quiet, and somewhere in the back the giggling had stopped and the light under the door went dark. The lamp on the table burned low, but neither of them moved to trim it, because sometimes you let things go the way they were going, and it was fine. It was more than fine. It was the specific texture of a life that had been built from ordinary moments by people who showed up and stayed. Outside, the Montana winter pressed on. Inside the Mercer house, a woman sat with her mending, and a man sat with his cold coffee, and neither of them spoke for a good long while. And the quiet between them was not empty, not in any way. It was full of 8 years of the accumulated truth of 2 people who had each found, in the one place they hadn't been looking, the thing they hadn't known they needed. The pale, crooked scar on Elias's forearm was visible in the lamplight. He didn't think about it anymore as something that had happened to him. He thought about it the way you think about a door. Not the door itself, but the room you walked into when it opened. And in the morning, as always, there would be work to do, and they would do it, and the ranch would continue its patient accumulation of one year on top of another, and the children would grow and leave and come back and build their own lives out of what they'd learned here. And the spring on the north pasture would keep running clean and cold through every drought and every hard season, and the scar would keep fading, and the fence would hold. And a crushed yellow wildflower had long since returned to the earth it came from. But what it had meant was still here, still standing, still entirely real. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.